Doctors. What happened when you diagnosed a COVID-19 denier with COVID-19?
ICU nurse here, 6 years. Dealt with COVID since March 2020. Actually had the first confirmed PT at our hospital. November to February was rough. I had a 2-week streak where every day 1 or 2 of my patients would die. We'd go up to 3 or 4 patient assignments. The norm is 2 to 1 or 1 to 1 if on certain equipment. Most all of the patients understood the severity of what they had. A handful didn't believe they had COVID, even though removing high-flow O2 or their BiPAP would put their SATs down into the 60s or 70s. Many had comorbidities that put them at risk: COPD, asthma, obesity, sleep apnea, smoking. I think people would refuse to be intubated because they knew what the outcome would be. Fight, hope, pray, fingers crossed, whatever you want to call it, delaying the inevitable. Our ICU attending would actually have them sign consent for intubation, if they were cognizant enough to do so. Almost all of them died. Very few made it out alive but still so sick and debilitated, some with trachs. One guy in particular sticks out. This was right after Christmas. 21 years old, HX1 German mark, obesity, sleep apnea, didn't like to take his insulin. Admitted with COVID, didn't believe he had it. Should have been tubed days before but refused. Then he ended up being intubated emergently. Took about 5 of us to prone him, lay him on his stomach, because his O2 SATs were in the 60s. Couldn't get a pulse, noticed no waveform on the art line. Had to flip him back over to do CPR for about an hour or so before we called it. Had a kid and a fiancé. Honestly, it was more of the families that denied their loved one had COVID. Upset, understandably, about not being able to visit. Zoom calls just don't cut it. I say this all as my parents, Mom, SD and Dad, SM, are all COVID deniers, even when I tell them what it's like. Well, those people had other things wrong with them though. They were older, they tell me. They send me links about all the conspiracy theories COVID. I got the Moderna in December and January, still haven't told them. It's awful. The facial swelling alone from being prone is enough to give a person nightmares. Watching someone go into multi-system organ failure, needing dialysis, unable to put them back onto their back, being maxed out on ventilator settings and that still not being enough to the point of barotrauma and collapsing a lung and needing a chest tube to reinflate it. Families saying to everything even though they had coded once or twice. Hearing families on Zoom crying, praying, singing as the patient is intubated, sedated, and paralyzed so the ventilator can do the work. Tearing up under all the PPE because yeah, we are still human. We work so hard and sometimes it doesn't effing matter. But we go back, day after day. I wish people who don't believe could see what I have seen. It might scare them enough to take precautions seriously and get the vaccine.
ICU, COVID ICU charge nurse here. Had a woman try leaving the ER against medical advice with COVID and was needing tons of O2. Our docs convinced her to get admitted. My wife was her ER nurse and brought her up to me. Patient was yelling and screaming, ripping off her mask, spitting and telling us we're all sheep between gasping for breath. Our docs told her she was close to needing to be intubated, breathing tube, and she just scoffed. We reached out to the husband who proceeded to swear and berate us, telling us we're keeping her prisoner, no visitors in our COVID unit, and that we can do whatever we need because none of this is real and it's all for show so you guys can get paid. She gets intubated, decompensates over the next few days, and finally codes. We code, perform CPR, give medications, defibrillate, etc. her for well over 1.5 hours before calling her time of death. The kicker was calling her husband and getting absolutely excoriated because we injected her with COVID as an experiment and killed her. He then had to be escorted out of the hospital when he came in to try getting up to the unit, without a mask, of course. This poo's getting exhausting.
So COVID isn't real but you injected her with COVID. Come on. These people are grown adults.
Doctor here. I diagnose people with COVID on the daily. Some people are actually really great about it, others are more difficult. I'll tell you a tale that occurred during my most recent shift. Back-to-back rooms and patients. Patient A, in room number 4, is a 23-year male, no medical history, comes in with body aches, malaise, and fatigue. Also had some mild nausea without abdominal pain or vomiting. Patient B, in room number 5, is a 51-year female, medical history of intermittent asthma, so she uses a puffer infrequently, comes in with shortness of breath, has some possible fevers at home. In triage it was noted that this patient's oxygen sats were in the 88 range and her heart rate wasn't elevated. Interestingly, when asked if she thought she had COVID, she said, "I can't have it, I tested negative 2 weeks ago when my son tested positive. He's been sick at home." You guessed it. Both people COVID plus. Patient A went home. He's doing great. Was extremely remorseful, and before he'd even left the ED he called his work to let them know he was positive and to get everyone there tested because he figured he had gotten the illness at work. IIRC, he worked in a small family-owned warehouse as a foreman. He also called his parents and they were getting him set up to sleep in the garage until his quarantine was up. I respected this guy. Patient B got admitted to the hospital because her O2 sats weren't great. When I went back to tell her she was COVID plus, she called me a liar and told me I must have made a mistake. She threatened to sign out AMA, against medical advice, but when she got up to leave she got so short of breath the nurse used that to convince her to stay. People are strange sometimes. I try not to let stuff bother me, but COVID deniers come very close to crossing that line.
One story stands out. Last summer a guy came to the ED with symptoms and tested positive. He refused admission for the classic list of reasons: "It's a complete hoax, and even if it's not a complete hoax it's not that big a deal, I'm strong enough," etc. A couple days later he was back in the ED with his mom, who he lived with and who was now also symptomatic. They were both admitted and eventually put on ventilators. Guy lived, but his mom didn't.
Dude killed his mom. I can't imagine how you live with that.
As an anesthesiologist, by the time someone's calling for us it's for intubation and the patient is in no condition to deny anything. Honestly, it's usually the family that's the issue and that needs to be escorted from the room.
That boggles my mind. By that point they can see that their loved one is having trouble breathing, and they're still trying to keep them from being treated.
My wife's a nurse, just had to deal with a patient who refused to get tested prior to her surgery, so they had to treat her like a COVID patient and needed to charge her for all the added PPE like gowns, goggles, etc. The kicker is, recovery wouldn't take her for observation while she was woken up, so the anesthesiologist needed to stay and monitor her in the room for nearly 3 hours. They are billed at $400 per 15 minutes, and there is no way her insurance is going to cover the extra cost because she signed a document saying she denied a COVID test.
$4,800 extra for the anesthesiologist.
NAD but an RN. I lost count of the number of patients I had who were COVID deniers, even right up until their last breath. During the peak in January, an average shift had me spend an hour or two being cussed out by patient family members that COVID was fake, we can't keep them from seeing their family member. Then I'd spend the shift sweating like I was in Kuwait, running around trying to keep everyone as comfortable as possible and maintaining their O2, and often repeatedly having to put someone's oxygen back on after they insisted they didn't need it. Multiple times I got told we had it all wrong, that it was just a cold, or that they weren't that sick and didn't need oxygen, even as they ran out of breath trying to get out a single word. Being in a super red rural area, it was to be expected. We even had COVID denying nurses for the longest time. Eventually they got the picture though and got with the program. Still, one of the worst that stuck with me wasn't the COVID denying patient. Patient believed in COVID and was a super great person. They were old though and had a caretaker. Caretaker didn't believe in COVID and was strictly anti-mask. Upon the caretaker being diagnosed with it, they refused to wear a mask or quarantine and said it was fake. They kept taking care of the person and never told them of the diagnosis. That person wound up getting COVID and being admitted to us.
I'm a doctor working in acute internal medicine. I've seen lots of COVID over the last 12 months, probably 300 plus cases. The one that sticks out in my mind the most was a 70-year-old lady with COPD. She refused to have a vaccine because she didn't trust it, despite the fact she was eligible for one for weeks beforehand, in the UK. Subsequently caught COVID and was admitted to hospital. She repeatedly doubted this was the diagnosis. She refused to go to our COVID high dependency unit despite quite significant respiratory failure. Of course, she deteriorated over a number of days to the point where she was on maximal oxygen on the ward, and at that point finally accepted treatment in HDU with high flow oxygen, although continued to doubt she had COVID. Died within 24 hours of her HDU admission, having refused to go to ICU. And of course, what did her family say? They were convinced she never had COVID and even went as far as accusing us of withholding life-saving treatment from her. Unfortunately, there's no treatment for stupidity. Edit. Spelling.
I work with a denier with COPD, mid-60s. No masks, refused the injection, etc. It blows my mind that she hasn't caught it. The worst thing is we have 2 immunocompromised people on the same floor as her.
They just kept denying they had it, stated they had something else, and tried to leave against medical advice while on high-flow nasal cannula, which we didn't let him do because he would have died within minutes. Before he was admitted to the hospital, he was symptomatic but refused to isolate at home. He gave it to his wife, who ended up in the ICU.
I just don't understand what these people get out of saying it's something else. If it's something else, wouldn't that mean they believe there's something terrible out there anyway? IDK, it's stupid. I don't get it.
Not a doctor, but my wife is, and a few of our family friends are as well. One of them is sports medicine, family. The guy came in, refused to use a mask. Our friend refused to treat him until he masked up. He had a newborn at the time too. When our friend told him he most likely has COVID, he needs to go to Tampa General immediately for testing and treatment. The guy said no, it's fake, he just needed some antibiotics. He left without getting a prescription, called back that night, demanded to be given oxygen. Our friend told him his only option was to go to the hospital. Guy had a severe case of COVID and ended up being hospitalized for a few weeks. He still thinks it was fake and was only a severe flu.
I wonder if the doctor would have diagnosed Wuhan flu, he would have complied better?
Nurse here. I had COVID and now I'm in rehabilitation because my lungs are at 70% capacity now. I was at 40% capacity, and now when I hear someone say that, I have the urge to slap them with a chair. I will need another year until I'm fully recovered. Edit. I thank you all the kind words and the awards. You guys, gals are awesome.
My worst experience was when a 2-year-old kid got diagnosed with COVID. His mother had brought him with CO fever and diarrhea. The child was severely dehydrated, and so we had to do a mandatory swab test since we planned to admit him. It came positive and the mother refused to admit it. We were ready to perform a repeat test, and we even advised for the parents to get tested. Her defense was the child never left the house. It's just I and the father who go to work daily. The grandmother babysits while we are away. How can he even get COVID without leaving the house? She had called her husband. He came with 10 to 15 relatives in a car. They broke a few chairs and then left with the baby. We just informed about the case to the COVID control center.
A family full of clowns? That's the only explanation I can come up with.
Not a doctor, but when my grandmother was dying, my relatives kept pushing me and the doctors to say what it really was. It added so much stress to an already difficult situation and was embarrassing as well. Even after she died, they kept saying things like, what if it was a stroke and she was misdiagnosed? Don't you think they just didn't want to help her? I was trying to arrange with hospice to go in and say goodbye, and my stupid second cousin was sending me YouTube videos about how COVID is fake. I was already not close with these people, and I am glad they are out of my life now.
People apparently take YouTube and social media very seriously, don't they?
My mom works for an OB/GYN who specializes in high-risk pregnancies and births, and he was called into the hospital to check out a woman whose due date was about 2 weeks away and who was very sick. He confirmed she had COVID and admitted her to the hospital until she gave birth, but she insisted it was a hoax and ended up checking herself out AMA, but not before she spat in the face of the nurse, who coincidentally had just completed chemo. That was near the beginning of the pandemic, and I'm so curious what happened to that lady. The nurse is okay, thank goodness.
That is at least assault, but possibly so much more depending on the outcome.
For sure. I asked my mom about it recently, and she said the nurse is fine and that she has no info on what happened to the patient.
I'm a student, funeral director, and I see families go to the funeral of someone who died of COVID-19 and still deny it. They started out shrieking at the doctors to change the cause of death on the death certificate. Now FEMA is helping with funeral expenses for COVID deaths. Suddenly there's changes of heart.
Physician here. The willful cognitive dissonance is real. It never ceases to amaze me how many patients will refuse assistance from me to register to get vaccinated, make claims that vaccines are harmful, but then accept my medical care on anything else that suits their whim. Patients absolutely have autonomy to refuse care. But why would you continue to see a physician and accept their medical advice and care if you think they would simultaneously recommend something to you that would be harmful? I've posed this question to patients who are vaccine hesitant. Why would you let me manage your diabetes and hypertension if you think I would harm you by recommending vaccinations? You cannot get any kind of thoughtful response aside from, I just don't want to be vaccinated.
Family members have come in with a sick family member and lied about exposure and/or symptoms despite a member's testing positive. This has lead to inappropriate management, delay in treatment, and exposure of staff and other families. The family members then get angry when told to isolate. Edit, typo.
Reading some of these stories are wild. Even at the brink of death, people still refuse that COVID is real or that they have it. They would rather believe anything else, almost to a point that I feel a doctor could tell them they are dying of AIDS or some made-up disease and they go, "Oh see, I knew it wasn't COVID."
Still had to treat her despite her accusing me of hiding the real diagnosis from her and doing something to make her sicker. Love my job.
I can't fathom that people really believe that in a pandemic their likelihood of having COVID is so low that they accuse people of hiding a diagnosis. Makes no sense to me.
I'm an anesthesiologist, and in our institution, we're the ones tasked with intubating COVID suspects, positive patients who would otherwise die without ventilatory support. And holy hell, there are a lot of patients who don't believe COVID is real. Most of them believe that it's just an elaborate lie that doctors use to label random patients to mooch money off them. Some of them scream at us, in whatever capacity their diseased lungs can allow them to. Some outright refuse intubation, in which case they die several hours later from respiratory failure. It's emotionally taxing having to face that every shift.
When was the stage of the Black Death where people said, "No, this isn't happening to anyone, this is a trick of the devil to make us think God has abandoned us, no one is actually sick at all"? Are we just worse at scientific reasoning than 13th century peasants?
Didn't diagnose a denier, so not exactly this, but did have a patient refuse testing upon admission and aggressively yelling COVID is a hoax. I calmly said, "Okay, nurse, since we won't know his status, please admit him to the COVID floor." He became a believer in an instant and requested to be tested. Edit. For those getting their pants into a twist over this. I work in a major city in the USA, and across our health system hospitals, we do our level best to not admit an untested patient to tested negative floor. Such patients, exposed, refusing, are marked PUI, patient under investigation, and are admitted to another floor, with other PUIs. This floor also houses non-ICU tested COVID plus patients. All patients are kept separate from each other still, in private rooms. Hopefully this makes better sense and ensures that the general public doesn't think we are placing all patients into a petri dish of coronavirus. Edit 2. Source. Since this seems to not be obvious, and the story is unbelievable, am a physician, trauma surgeon, surgical critical care intensivist, and director of a surgical ICU that also functions as a COVID ICU during case spikes.
So basically he never really doubted the virus and just thought his own risk of catching it was low, and F everyone else.
Not a doctor, but nurse that worked in one of our COVID ICUs. Lady was intubated, sedated, pronned, therapy that involves lying the patient on their stomach in order to oxygenate the lung more effectively. Reserved for very sick COVID patients, the whole shebang. Miraculously she recovers and is weaned down to high-flow nasal cannula, still a fairly high oxygen requirement, but better than needing the breathing tube. This spiteful she-devil would purposely cough on us nurses as we went into her room to give meds care, simultaneously yelling that COVID isn't real, and that we gave her COVID face with rolling eyes. God, this winter sucked.
I was hospitalized in the ICU for a while and wasn't far off from intubation myself. I was lucky and responded well to donor plasma and remdesivir and was able to recover surprisingly quickly once the pneumonia started clearing up. If it makes you feel any better, there are many more of us that considered you folks effing troopers and incredible. I made sure to thank each and every one of you every time they came in, from the multiple blood pulls, attempts at least, before I got my midline, the multitude of breathing treatments and shots, to having to balance my giant 6 feet 5 inches ass to the bathroom once I was able to walk enough to piss in an actual toilet. You guys saved my life, and I'll never forget it. So, something to consider when the behavior of these poo stains wear you down. Edit. Thanks for love, folks. One thing to add. The other thing that saved my life was quitting smoking 5 years prior to this. I weaned myself off with a vaporizer for about a year before dropping it entirely. Seriously, if you're smoking, quit, because it may bite you in the ass sooner than you think.
I appreciate your sentiment and am so glad to hear you're doing better.
RN here with most of 2020 spent in COVID land. I never had anyone refuse treatment when things got serious. I know some of the MDs I worked with got yelled at, like the rest of us. But honestly that happens frequently anyway. Some denier patients lived, many of which had accepted reality by the end of their stay after seeing what we all were going through to treat them. Some died telling me I was a sheep or an idiot or a liar between gasps of air. COVID didn't care.
Imagine your last words are calling the guy trying to save your life a liar.
Not a doctor but work in the psych area of the emergency department. Needless to say there's a lot of psychiatric illness-based COVID denial and/or paranoia. Patients often refuse swabs thinking we are trying to implant microchips. I only bring up my experience to contrast my psychiatrically unwell COVID-denying patients to the psychologically unfit COVID-denying population. One is because of brain chemical imbalances and the other due to propaganda, politicization, and poor critical thinking skills. It's interesting that the outcomes are similar, if only in this respect.
I work on a COVID unit and I ran into a patient like this. They'd tell me over and over again about how they weren't really sick and about how I didn't need to be gowned up in PPE. They even tried to take my face shield off. If you test positive for COVID 2 times then you have COVID. People are crazy.
Greater than they even tried to take my face shield off. That is beyond crazy IMO. Be nuts all to yourself, don't effing touch others you psycho.
Infectious disease doctor here. Seen about 450 to 500 COVID patients in the hospital since it all started. Only one patient ever accused me of using the nasal swab to give him COVID, along with a microchip. A handful have, ranted non-stop about China. Everyone else has been sick enough to accept it, but lots still refuse the idea of vaccination even after being in the ICU. Lots of questions about vaccination after having the infection. Immunity after infection can last as little as 3 months. Immunity from vaccination lasts much longer and has the benefit of not putting you and those around you at risk. You can get the shot as soon as you recover and come out of isolation, no need to wait for 3 months. Link. Change to immunity can last as little as 3 months. It can be longer depending on the person, but you can't predict ahead of time. I've got a patient in the hospital right now reinfected at the 4-month mark.
Off topic, but I got my second shot the other day. I felt slightly ill the following day. Was that just the batteries activating the microchips? Can I expect my 5 grams to improve or will it still be horrible since it's AT&T? Letter. I have treated a young male in our ICU with critical COVID-19 with severe diabetic ketoacidosis. He did not believe in insulin. Yes, you are reading this right, or other anti-diabetics, even though insulin is inexpensive in our country. He tried to treat his type 2 diabetes with herbs. His HbA1c, the lab value showing the state of his diabetes on the longer run, was off the roof. He did not vaccinate. He was offered, did not wear a mask, did not distance, and did not believe in any of this corona bull poo. Most of this information was obtained from his 20-year-old daughter, as he was quite disoriented at presentation and was intubated urgently. She was sobbing through the phone every day for 1.5 months until he died. I held the phone with his daughter on call to his ears multiple times when he was still intubated, but his mind cleared up and his sedation was optimal. I was quite convinced that he realized his mistake on the ventilator, with lines and tubes inserted into his body everywhere and in his last clear moments, when his mind allowed, but I cannot be absolutely sure. I often think about the last conversation and last mental images people have before their death.
I'm type 1. Getting COVID is a big fear of mine, and I assume many people's in this thread. Doctors and nurses have to defer to the patient for boluses, which I almost always have to force their hand, and make them contact my diabetes medical team. Being diabetic sucks, but not being in range is so much worse. the worst I've ever felt, for a long period of time, in my life was before diagnosis. My A1C was 11.5 mmol, and I felt like someone was dragging me through mud with glass in it. Can't imagine DKA with COVID.
I'm an ODP and work alongside anaesthetists in theatres and ICU. To be honest, I've not really seen anything from patients regarding outright denial. However, I have seen some of my friends on Facebook who have spouted all sorts of lies. That's really disappointing to say the least. One of them, a friend of my wife, works at the hospital. She works in admin and refuses to wear a mask and even bought some certificate off the net so she doesn't have to wear one in public. Anyway, that's being escalated up the chain of disciplinary action.
If you have such a bad respiratory issue that you can't wear a mask, then maybe you should stay home. I swear these people piss me off so bad. I hope she gets appropriate punishment for her refusal.
Absolutely, there is nothing at all wrong with her physically, she just doesn't believe in COVID. And this is someone who works in a hospital. Plain weird.
Not a doctor, but my cousin-in-law was a COVID denier. Went to his COVID denier girlfriend's family house for Thanksgiving without telling his parents that they were COVID deniers. He was living with his parents, my wife's aunt and uncle, since he had recently divorced his wife. Got back and found out a week later that the whole girlfriend's family tested positive. He got it. So his parents both got it. His mother was in treatment for breast cancer and his dad had asthma, by the way, and they are not COVID deniers. His mother recovered, but his dad, my wife's uncle, went from coughing and wheezing the day after Christmas to the ER on New Year's Day. Within 24 hours after that he was put on a ventilator. 3 weeks later he passed. So yeah, my COVID denier cousin-in-law effectively killed my wife's uncle, and now that whole part of the family is really tense as his brothers kinda blame him for killing their dad, but their mom, wife's aunt, isn't willing to blame her son. F COVID deniers. It's not really a joke. These assholes are literally killing people through gross negligence and idiocy.
My mother killed my aunt, her own sister, who was at risk, just to prove a point about COVID supposedly being a hoax. It's the second relative that my mother killed, now. Mom thinks very highly of herself, she is very religious and believes she belongs in heaven and that I'm a heathen for being gay. Sure. I love someone of the same sex as me. But at least I didn't kill 2 people.
I'm an attending physician at our triage unit. On a Friday, an older gentleman, 60+ years, came in with his entire family, wife, sister, Bill, 2 newfies and 3 children, none of them with a face mask. All had mild COVID symptoms except him. He was saturating 80% with evident shortness of breath. We insisted in doing PCR and a chest CAT scan looking for COVID, but he and his wife refused, saying that COVID wasn't real and it was just a bacterial infection. The more we talked with him, the more agitated he got, to the point that his face was red. We suggested hospitalizing him to stabilize him and start treatment, but they accused us of exaggerating his symptoms and that we only wanted to hospitalize him so we could steal the liquid in his knees, a stupid rumor that was going around when this whole thing started. They both cursed at us and said they were going to a better hospital to get antibiotics. Fast forward 24 hours later on Saturday, we get a call from the hospital next county over telling us that they intubated one of our patients because he went into respiratory failure when he arrived, and they had to transfer him here because they don't have the appropriate equipment. We transfer the patient on Sunday only to find out on the CAT scan he had 90% of lung damage. He passed away on Monday morning. Just before the family took the body away, I gave the widow the death certificate that I filled out, and before walking away, she turns around and waves the certificate yelling, "See? I told you it wasn't COVID. It says here, death due to pulmonary pneumonia due to SARS-CoV-2. I knew it was a bacteria. I told her, SARS-CoV-2 is COVID-19, ma'am. Edit, because everyone's asking what happened afterwards. Not much. She yelled, "No, it's SARS. It's a bacteria," and stormed off. It's actually one of the mildest encounters I've had with a grieving widow.
It's difficult to argue with a genius, but it's impossible to argue with an idiot.
I'm a family doc who mostly does outpatient. I live in a pretty conservative area with a good proportion of COVID deniers. So I've been seeing COVID deniers since this mess became politicized. I've lost a few patients over the mask mandate. Anyway, I'm pretty pleased to say that several of my COVID-denying patients have completely turned their attitude around when they, or a close family member, contracted COVID. Even if their case wasn't severe, the sudden terror that they could wind up on a ventilator overnight really puts the fear of God into people. Unfortunately, I still have some patients who are still pretty obnoxious despite their COVID diagnosis. They mostly dig in deeper into paranoia. If not about the virus itself, then about the circumstances surrounding them contracting it. If Fauci had done his job from the beginning, it never would have hit this town. It's the entire fault of Obamacare that I can't get the experimental immunoglobulin treatment. It's not, your eligibility for the infusion is dependent on a list of risk factors. And, probably my favorite. So I have COVID and it's completely your responsibility to fix it. I need you to send hydroxychloroquine, zinc, VD, lisinopril and azithromycin to the pharmacy, then they proceed to get pissed at me when I don't. And yes, each of those things were actual things patients said to me after getting their diagnosis. I could probably think of more, but those were the most memorable ones.
I'm sorry. I hope you have some nice patients who appreciate you, too. Also, do you still have eyeballs? Or have they completely rolled out of their sockets from all these deniers?
Greater than also, do you still have eyeballs? Or have they completely rolled out of their sockets from all these deniers? Rolling on the floor laughing, rolling on the floor laughing, rolling on the floor laughing, rolling on the floor laughing. That's amazing. I had a good laugh from that. Depending on the person, I really do try to approach them with some patience. It's hard to believe sometimes, but some people have just flat out been a victim of propaganda, whether it be from the president, from news organizations, from their local church, from their family, the internet, or any combination of that. And some folks just might not have the education for the cognitive reasoning necessary to make rational decisions. I'm not trying to be an intellectual elitist or anything here, but with my patient population in this small town, I really do have to explain things like I'm talking to a child. Not because I'm trying to be a patronizing DK head, but because some people genuinely have zero idea what I'm talking about when I use a word like artery, metastasis, or diabetes. Asterisk asterisk that said. Asterisk asterisk. I pretty much have zero patience these days for the folks who come in half-cocked with Fox News harebrained talking points that they haven't taken 2 seconds to even think about. You can usually tell the difference between the folks who are genuinely uneducated versus the folks who come in wanting to see if you're one of those liberal doctors. I once told one of these patients to go home, study epidemiology, and not to come back to my office until he could explain what a positive predictive value is. But he'd already pissed me off by that point.
I had a lady who was maxed out on high flow, next step is breathing tube, who still refused she had COVID and was holding a negative test in her hand that she had taken a week prior.
The COVID equivalent of the Black Knight from Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Doc chiming in. They told me I was wrong. Obviously, there's no way they had COVID despite coming into the for shortness of breath, cough, and fevers. When I mentioned that their wife who was several rooms down also had COVID, their response was, "Oh, that makes sense because she always gets sick." When I asked how it made sense that they wouldn't have COVID with the same symptoms, I was told that it was because they were overall healthy and only took their mask off to eat and drink in the casino upside down face.
As a casino worker, I can guarantee it was off the second they got past security.
I was testing a guy yesterday who asked me if he still needed to be tested in order to be on a college campus even though he had received both doses PF Pfizer already. I said yes, it's a CDC mandate, and there isn't enough longitudinal study on the current vaccine's effectiveness on the variants to make a call on that yet. So we keep testing everyone once a week. Then he hits me with, "You know all this COVID crap is bullpoo, right? Effing government and Illuminati spooks trying to suppress us." I told him that 92 people have died of COVID under my care in the last 14 months, to keep his QAnon garbage to himself and to have a nice day. I got reprimanded this morning lol. Most worth it slap on the wrist of my life. Edit. Hey, thanks for all the sweet Reddit clout. In lieu of any awards that may cost money, I would instead recommend that you donate to The Nurse's House, link which is a foundation that assists RNs struggling with mental and financial well-being. They do some great work. Thanks again.
Bray, some racist lady I work with was going around saying China virus, Wuhan virus. Then she tried to peddle essential oils with eucalyptus as a COVID protection. I wrote an email to my supervisors about it and they got mad because they said I was being condescending when I told them about a woman we all work with endangering people by spreading false information about the virus. No, she didn't get in trouble for spreading bullpoo. No, she didn't get in trouble for being racist. Yes, I got in trouble for writing an email before going to speak with them casually, because now my email created a paper trail that they are forced to act upon. This all happened after this racist lady came back from mandatory quarantine, being the first to have COVID in our workplace.
I've been confrontational to these patients out of respect for my ICU colleagues and nurses. They put their lives on the line for stupidity. Essentially, I ask all these patients to cure heart disease, stroke, ulcerative colitis and Crohn's since they've figured out COVID is fake. I ask them if they have any thoughts on recent stenting medications or immunomodulatory meds. If they're aware of any medications down the pipeline since they're ahead of me and have more knowledge than me. I also ask them how well they did in math in school so I could better understand probabilities.
Similarly, I've memorized a copy-pasta-esque thing for anti-vaxxers that act like they know what they're talking about. I am not an immunologist at all. Goes something like, Karen, you've done your research on vaccines, correct? So what was your opinion on the PCV2 specific lymphocytes that increase the number of Th, Tc, and CD3 positive T cells in the blood of DNA vaccine immune groups? Since you don't know what you're talking about, please stop acting like you do. I have absolutely no idea what I'm saying, but it always shuts them up right away because it actually is medical jargon.
Not a doctor, but I work at an urgent care that does COVID PCR testing. This lady tested positive and for the entirety of her mandatory quarantine time would not stop calling the clinic. She insisted that we were running some scam by reporting positive tests to the IRS and getting kickbacks. We don't report to anyone besides the state and even they don't do much. I honestly felt bad for her. She was an immigrant that was working as a nanny under the table and got fired for getting sick. She felt super alone and didn't know how to go about dealing with her situation. As someone who contracted COVID myself, I understood her frustration. You feel like you just get handed this test result, your life stops, and you're still expected to pay rent, groceries, etc. Definitely doesn't justify her denying a very real virus, but still sad.
Greater than you're still expected to pay rent, groceries, etc. Damn, if only there had been people advocating for rent freezes and a social safety net for this kind of thing. God, I hate it here sometimes.
For reals. And groceries become even more expensive when you have to get them with the various delivery apps. It's a nightmare. Couple in their mid-60 years. Very rich. They came with all symptoms. Screaming COVID-19 don't exist. For them, it was a flu. Drink hot tea with lemon and honey at home. Some Advil for fever. Everything will be alright. Refuse to be hospitalized. Try to sue the hospital with their army of lawyers. It was in June 2020. They signed their papers. Go home. Come 2 days later on the hospital. Dead. Their son was in Japan. Never come to reclaim body. He just called to confirm the death of his parents. End of the story.
That son knew what was up.
Obligatory, not me. I'm a key worker in retail, but a girl I work with is also a trainee nurse. One day she came in and seemed real upset, told us she'd had a female COVID-positive patient lying in bed, on a ventilator, dying, and in her final moments her partner was shouting at her, "Stop being so dramatic, COVID isn't real, you just need to believe you'll get better." After she passed, he started screaming at the doctors and nurses that they'd killed her, injected her with something, anything except believe the truth in front of him. Genuinely heartbreaking. Sometimes we still talk about that woman. I hope she found peace.
I have an aunt who, being a COVID denier, is just a part of all the crap she denies. Half a year ago she went to the hospital because of shortness of breath. She's over 300 pounds. But she was gasping for air even sitting down. She gets told she has COVID and she's in denial and calls me up to pick her up because, in her own words, "These poos are trying to kill me. They gone and infected me." I refused and hanged up. She alter posts about her being till she has COVID and how it's such a lie. She then gets messages saying it was her fault they all got COVID. My aunt went to a party and got about 24 people infected. She's okay now but still in denial and wants to sue the hospital because it made her fat. Not fatter, fat. She thinks she was some slim bitch before the hospital and thinks she's get a lot of money from the settlement. She just needs to find a lawyer first.
Hold up. Your aunt is 300 pounds but somehow didn't realize it until after she went to the hospital?
I seem to have the opposite situation. Came down with some serious symptoms, cough, fever, aches, etc., in March of 2020, so emailed my doc about it thinking that I might have this new disease that is hitting the newswires. I didn't want to go in because of how contagious it was reported to be. He told me it was nothing to worry about and to drink fluids. I start feeling worse over the next 2 days and I find out someone I was near tested positive, so I reached out again with that info. Again was told that it wasn't serious, and he wouldn't test me. I asked him, out of an abundance of caution, how long I should quarantine, just to be safe, was easily able to work from home and had enough food to last a couple of weeks. His response to all of that was that it was highly unlikely that I had COVID, and the mother for her told me that I can go out in public whether I feel I want to. Later that year, I was curious and took an antibody test, which to no one's surprise said I was positive for antibodies. God knows how many other people had COVID that he wouldn't test and told them to go out into public.
My wife and I travel for work and she happens to work in medical labs, usually large hospitals. I've been shocked by the sheer amount of lab techs and the like who refuse to wear masks and nonchalantly go about life as if COVID weren't real.
My sister is a microbiologist who works for a government research facility in FL where they do research into yep, you guessed it, communicable diseases such as viruses. She managed to catch COVID at work from other idiots showing up maskless to work. Not everyone who works there is a scientist, but goddamn, you work for someplace like, say, the CDC, and even if you're just in maintenance, why wouldn't you take precautions? Because, Florida, of course. She's looking at employment in another state now.
All the way up to the higher echelons of the industry. It's really hard to cope with the fact that we are in a time that should have been defined by COVID, but instead it's being shaped by the people who are able to somehow rationalize not caring about others.
Our daughter is a frontline nurse. She had one dying woman foxbot screaming, between gasping for air, "Tell me what I really have. Tell me, I should know. You have COVID-19. COVID does not exist. It's fake and being used to control us. Tell me what I have."
Ma'am, you have donkey brains.
Didn't diagnose, but I'm sure you'll appreciate the mental gymnastics. I worked OBS and gyno a few months back. For obstetrics we had an amber ward, confirmed non-COVID ward, and a red ward, confirmed COVID, no test done. We'd require mum and partner to both get COVID tests done in our clinic the day before the planned admission so we knew which ward to place them in. One patient refused to have the swab taken because she thought COVID was a hoax. So we were told her she'd have to stay in the red ward during her admission as we couldn't confirm she didn't have COVID if she didn't have a test. She went absolutely mental saying, "You can't do that. What if I get COVID?"
A friend of mine has COVID denier parents. Her dad is a pastor in Oklahoma. He contracted COVID because they were having services without masks, since this whole COVID thing is just a way to suppress Christians, and came down with a pretty severe case. After it was all done, they remaining COVID downplayers, anti-mask, anti-vaccine because God kept them safe, and it wasn't that bad, since they didn't get hospitalized. Her mum had a very mild case, but her grandma died. But since she was already ill she went on hospice, so it didn't count. Reading all these posts just confirms I don't have enough empathy and patience to work in that field. Edit, wow, so this is what it's like when a comment blows up LMAO. Thanks for letting me read y'all's responses.
Yup, patients trying to pull off my PPE? Said patient would start to have other issues as well as COVID. But yeah, to many stupid people out there.
Obligatory, not a doctor, but my wife is an ICU nurse and had dozens of patients who used their last breaths to try and convince her it was a Chinese attempt at propaganda.
That's terrible. I went to donate convalescent plasma. Imagine my surprise when right after sticking the needle in my arm, the phlebotomist looked me directly in the eyes and said, "It is so sad you are having to do this and so many people are dying because China made this virus and sent it to us." I almost bit through my tongue to stay silent, but there was no way I was going to argue with her when she had a needle in my arm with me hooked up to a machine. My mind was blown. Thank you for watching. We upload new videos every day, so be sure to come back for more fun. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed the video.